My name is Emily Carter, I'm 42 years old, and I work as a clinical lab technologist in a hospital genetics department. The day my mother-in-law secretly DNA tested my 9-year-old daughter and announced at a family dinner that she wasn't related to them at all, everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my place in that family, and even my own child's identity collapsed in under 10 minutes. I still remember the sound of the fork slipping out of my husband's hand when she said it. That tiny metallic clink against the ceramic plate sounded louder than anything else in the room, like the moment reality cracked open. And I remember thinking, this is not happening, not to me, not to my daughter. But it did. I wish I could say I stood up immediately, that I defended her, that I shut it down the way people imagine they would in their heads. But the truth is I sat there frozen, my lab-trained brain trying to process something that didn't follow any logic I understood. Because DNA doesn't lie. That's what I've worked with for 17 years. I've read genetic profiles that confirmed paternity in court cases, solved identity mismatches in newborn testing, and flagged rare mutations that saved lives. I understand probability, contamination, cross-matching errors. I understand science. So when my mother-in-law, Patricia Reynolds, calmly placed a printed report on the table and said, I had this done privately, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. My first thought wasn't rage. It was disbelief. We were at her house in Westchester, a Sunday dinner she insisted on every month. October 6, 2024, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. My daughter, Lily, was sitting between me and my husband, Daniel, swinging her legs under the chair, humming softly to herself while eating rolls she always tore into tiny pieces before swallowing. She was 9 years old and completely unaware that her life was about to be rewritten by adults who should have protected her. Patricia had always been controlled. That's the only word I can use. Controlled in the way she smiled, the way she asked questions that weren't really questions, the way she looked at Lily sometimes like she was studying a painting she didn't approve of. But I never thought she would go this far. Not DNA testing a child. Not humiliating her in front of everyone. Not weaponizing science the way she did. Patricia, my husband said slowly, leaning forward, what are you talking about? She didn't even look at him first. Her eyes stayed on me. That was the first real warning sign I processed in hindsight. This wasn't about confusion or concern. This was targeted. I sent a strand of Lily's hair to a private lab, she said. I needed confirmation. Confirmation of what? I asked, my voice already quieter than I intended. Her lips pressed into a thin line, like she was disappointed I was forcing her to say it out loud. That she is not biologically part of the Reynolds family. Silence. Not just quiet, complete system failure silence, the kind that feels like pressure in your ears. My daughter looked up at me then, still innocent, still chewing. Mommy. That's when something in me cracked. What did you do? Daniel finally said, his voice rising. You tested our daughter without permission. I did what was necessary, she replied calmly, and I have the results. She slid the paper forward. I didn't want to look at it, but I did, because in my line of work ignoring data is never an option, even when it hurts. The report was formatted like any other lab document, clean header, chain of custody listed, sample source noted as hair follicle obtained from minor subject. And then the result lined. Probability of biological relation to paternal family line, 0%. 0. I remember laughing once, just a short, broken sound that didn't belong in the room, because that number didn't make sense. It couldn't, not unless everything else in my life was a lie. That's impossible, I said automatically. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. Is it? My profession kicked in before my emotions could catch up. Contamination, mislabeling, sample mix-up, private lab unverified chain. I could list 100 reasons in my head why this report might be wrong. But none of them mattered, because Patricia had already turned it into a weapon. She leaned back in her chair, almost satisfied. I think we need to be honest now. There's been doubt in my mind for years. Lily never quite looked like the rest of the family, and now I have confirmation. Mom, Daniel snapped, standing up now, you don't get to just... She is not our blood, Patricia interrupted sharply. That was the moment everything changed. Not the test, not the paper. That sentence, she is not our blood. Lily stopped chewing. I looked at her and saw her trying to understand what was happening by reading our faces the way children do when the world suddenly feels unsafe. Am I in trouble? She asked softly. I reached for her hand immediately. No, sweetheart, no, you're not in trouble. But my voice was shaking. Patricia stood up slowly, smoothing her napkin like she had just concluded a meeting. I thought it was better to address this now, before it goes further. Before what goes further? I asked, my voice sharper now. She finally looked at me directly. Before you continue building illusions. That word, illusions, hit harder than anything else. Because that's what she believed my daughter was, a mistake, a deception, something to be corrected. Daniel grabbed the paper off the table, scanning it again like he could force it to change. This doesn't make sense, Emily would never. Then explain it, Patricia cut in. Explain why she doesn't match any of us genetically. Every eye in the room shifted to me. That's when I felt it, not anger yet, something colder, something like detachment, the same feeling I get when I see a contaminated sample in the lab and realize someone's entire conclusion is about to collapse. I don't need to explain anything to you, I said quietly, because you don't understand what you're looking at. Patricia gave a small smile. I understand enough. But she didn't. None of them did. And I knew in a way that made my stomach drop that this wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about me. My place in that family had always been conditional. I was never truly one of them. I was the outsider who married in, the scientist daughter-in-law who corrected grammar and explained things no one asked to understand. And Patricia had been waiting for a moment like this. Daniel sat back down slowly like his body had lost its instructions. We're going to test again, he said. We're doing this properly, hospital grade, chain of custody I can trust. Patricia shook her head. There's no need, I already know what I needed to know. But I was already standing. I do, I said. Everyone looked at me. And for the first time that night, I felt my lab mind and my human mind align. If you really tested her, I said carefully, then you also have a legal chain of custody issue. You obtained biological material from a minor without parental consent. That alone invalidates. I don't care about legality, she said coldly. That's when I understood something worse than betrayal. She didn't want truth. She wanted permission. Permission to reject my daughter. Permission to rewrite reality. Lily started crying quietly then, not loudly, just small confused tears she was trying to hide. I pulled her closer instinctively, shielding her from the table, from the eyes, from the damage spreading through that room like spilled chemicals. Emily, Daniel said, voice breaking slightly now, just tell me this isn't real. I looked at him, and for a moment, I hated how much I still wanted him to believe me without proof. I have never lied about anything in my life, I said, not once, you know that. Patricia gave a small shrug. People lie without realizing it all the time. And that's when I saw it clearly. This wasn't about DNA. This was about control. About deciding who belonged. And Patricia had just declared my daughter an outsider in front of the entire family. The rest of the evening blurred after that, voices rising, chairs moving, my daughter clinging to my arm like it was the only solid thing left in the world, Daniel trying to reason with his mother, Patricia refusing to back down. At some point I remember standing up, taking Lily's hand and saying, "We're leaving." No one stopped us. No one followed immediately. But as I walked out of that house into the cold October air, I heard Patricia's voice behind me one last time. If you're confident in the truth, Emily, you won't be afraid of what comes next. And I remember thinking, she had no idea what she had just started. Because in my world, in genetics, in data, in evidence-based science, truth doesn't just defend itself. It exposes everything around it. And that includes her own marriage. I just didn't know it yet. I didn't sleep that night. Lily finally passed out around 2:17 a.m., still clutching the sleeve of my hoodie like letting go would make everything real again. I stayed on the edge of her bed in our small townhouse in Connecticut, watching her breathe, listening to the heater click on and off like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Downstairs, Daniel was still awake. I could hear him moving around, slow steps, then stopping, then starting again, like a man trying to walk out of a thought and failing. At 3:04 a.m. he came upstairs. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway of Lily's room, looking at both of us like he wasn't sure where he was allowed to belong anymore. "She's asleep," he whispered. I nodded. He stepped closer but didn't sit. That was new. Daniel always sat, always tried to make things feel normal even when they were. "I called the lab," he said. That got my attention immediately. "What lab?" "The one she used," he replied. "The private one in New Jersey." My stomach tightened, and... He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything before he even spoke. "They said they only processed one sample under that name," he said slowly. "No parental consent form on file, no legal guardian authorization." I exhaled sharply. "So she broke protocol. That doesn't validate the result, it invalidates it." "I know," he said quickly. "I told them that. I told them you work in this field. I asked about contamination, mix-up, anything. And they said the sample was labeled and sealed properly when received." Silence. That was the kind of sentence that sounds simple but carries weight in my world. Proper labeling, sealed chain, no reported contamination. Which meant the only weak point wasn't the lab. It was the assumption that the sample came from Lily in the first place. "I want to see it," I said immediately. Daniel looked confused. "See what?" "The report, the metadata, the chain of custody log, everything she submitted." "She won't give it." "Then I'll subpoena it if I have to," I said without thinking. That made him flinch slightly. Because that wasn't just emotional anymore, that was procedural, that was my profession taking over. And Daniel knew what that meant. When I got like this, I stopped being just his wife. I became someone who could dismantle systems. He sat down finally, rubbing his face. "Emily, my mother wouldn't fake something like that." I laughed once quietly, but it wasn't humor. She already did something worse than fake it. She used it. He didn't respond. We stayed like that for a long time. The only sound was Lily's breathing. Finally he said, "What if it's true?" I turned to him so fast he looked startled. "What? What if the test is right?" he said more carefully now. "What if there's something we don't know?" That sentence hit differently coming from him. Not accusation, not hostility. Fear. I stood up slowly. "I have worked in genetics for 17 years, I said quietly. "I have literally identified switched newborns in hospital records. I've corrected paternity errors in court cases where men were going to prison for child support fraud they didn't commit. I know what biological mismatch looks like." I stepped closer. "That report is not proof of anything, except what someone wanted it to say." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I believe you," he whispered, "but I also need to understand why she did this." That was the first crack in the foundation of our marriage I could feel forming in real time. Because understanding her meant doubting me. And I could see him starting to split between those two worlds. The next morning, Patricia called a family meeting. Not asked. Not suggested. Cold. At 11:00 a.m. Daniel got a group text. "Come to my house, important clarification needed." No apology, no tone change, just continuation. We didn't respond, we drove anyway. Lily stayed with my sister. I couldn't let her near that atmosphere again. When we arrived, the house already had people inside. Daniel's older brother Mark, his wife Sandra, and two cousins I barely knew. It felt staged, like she had assembled an audience. Patricia was waiting in the living room, sitting perfectly upright, hands folded like she was about to deliver a lecture. On the coffee table was the same report. Printed again. Multiple copies this time. She had prepared. "I'm glad you all came," she said calmly. "I think there's been some confusion." Daniel crossed his arms. You violated our daughter's privacy, there's no confusion. Patricia ignored him and looked at me instead. I want to clarify something, she said. I never intended harm, I only intended truth. That's not how truth works, I replied immediately. A small smile. In your field, maybe not, but in families, truth is often ignored until it becomes unavoidable. Mark frowned. Mom, what are you saying exactly? She picked up the report like it was evidence in a courtroom. I am saying that Lily Carter is not biologically connected to the Reynolds lineage. Sandra shifted uncomfortably. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, Patricia corrected. It's data. That word again. Data. She was using my world against me. And she was doing it confidently enough that part of the room was starting to believe her. That's when I realized the real damage wasn't the test. It was repetition. Say something loudly enough, calmly enough, and people start treating it like fact. I want the raw data file, I said again firmly. Patricia tilted her head. Why? Because I work in genetics, I said, and I can verify it. A pause. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. I already had another sample tested. Silence. Even Daniel froze. What? He said. She reached into a folder and pulled out a second sheet. This one is yours, she said to me. My stomach dropped. You tested me. I had to rule out errors, she replied smoothly. That is illegal without consent, I said instantly. She shrugged. I was careful. Daniel stepped forward now, voice raised. You tested my wife and my daughter. Are you insane? Patricia didn't even blink. And the result was consistent, she said. She slid the second paper forward. I didn't want to look. But I did. And this one was worse. Because it didn't just say not related. It said something more specific. Genetic markers do not align with expected maternal lineage probability thresholds. My hands went cold. That was impossible. Not because of me. Because of how she would have obtained it. This isn't mine, I said immediately. You didn't have a verified sample from me. I took it from your hairbrush, she said simply. That room went dead silent. Daniel turned slowly toward me. Not accusing. Not yet. But searching. And I felt it, the shift. The beginning of doubt entering the space where trust used to be. Patricia leaned back again, satisfied now. I think we should all accept that there is something unusual here, she said softly. And I think we should also accept that Emily has not been fully honest with this family. That was the moment everything stopped being about Lily. It became about me. And I realized, standing in that living room, that Patricia hadn't just attacked my daughter. She had engineered a situation where I was now the variable. The unknown factor. The problem to be solved. And I was a clinical lab technologist, which meant I understood exactly what happens to a system when someone decides one element doesn't belong. They isolate it. They question it. They remove it. But what Patricia didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that I don't just analyze data. I verify it. And once I saw the structure of what she had done, I already knew where the flaw had to be. Because no system survives contact with a liar who doesn't understand the science they're trying to weaponize. And Patricia Reynolds had just made her first mistake. She assumed I wouldn't check everything. By the time we left Patricia's house that day, something in Daniel had already shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was hesitation. The kind that shows up in small moments. How long he looked at me before speaking, how he answered his mother's calls but didn't tell me, how he sat on the edge of our bed that night without touching me like he was afraid I might be made of something fragile and temporary. Lily was still with my sister. She didn't know the second wave of what had happened. I made sure of that. But I knew. Because Patricia didn't stop at the living room. She started calling people, and I started seeing it in fragments. A text from Daniel's cousin: "Is everything okay with your daughter? My mom is saying weird things." A voicemail from Sandra: "Emily, I don't know what's going on, but people are talking." By Tuesday, it wasn't private anymore. By Wednesday, it had become a story. And stories in families spread faster than facts ever do. I went into work that morning at the hospital genetics lab like nothing had happened. That was the only way I knew how to function, through structure, through protocol, through routine. At 8:15 a.m., I ran a standard maternal mitochondrial comparison for a neonatal screening batch. At 9:02 a.m., I reviewed a mislabeled sample flagged for reprocessing. At 9:47 a.m., I corrected a sequencing error in a congenital marker panel. Normal work, clean logic, predictable systems. Unlike my life. At 10:30 a.m., my supervisor, Dr. Harris, called me into his office. He closed the door. That alone told me this wasn't routine. "Emily," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand this is coming from a professional concern." My stomach tightened immediately. "What's going on?" He slid a printed email across the desk. It was forwarded from hospital administration. Subject line: "Inquiry regarding staff member Carter, alleged genetic discrepancy in family lineage." My hands went still. "What is this?" I asked. He sighed. "It came from a private citizen, a Mrs. Reynolds. She claims there may be a conflict of interest in your handling of genetic data due to personal irregularities." I actually laughed at that, one short, sharp sound. Personal irregularities. He didn't smile. "She included copies of DNA reports," he continued, "and she requested we review your lab access logs." My vision narrowed slightly. She had escalated. Not just family anymore. Work. Reputation. Identity. I leaned forward. "Those reports are not valid. She performed unauthorized testing on a minor and then fabricated." "I believe you," he interrupted gently, "but I still have to follow procedure. That's the part people don't understand about systems like mine. Belief doesn't matter. Only traceability does." "Are you suspending me?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "but I need you to step away from active case handling until we verify there's no breach." That hit harder than I expected. Because I had done nothing wrong. And yet I was being pulled out of the system anyway. By noon, I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. This is what Patricia had done. She didn't just attack my daughter. She built doubt around me like a contamination field. And now everything I touched was being questioned. My phone buzzed. "Daniel." I didn't answer immediately. When I finally did, his voice was different. Tired. "Emily, can you come home?" I already knew what that meant. Something else had happened. When I got home, the house felt wrong. Not messy, not damaged. Just altered. Like someone had rearranged the emotional furniture while I was gone. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table. And Patricia was there. I stopped in the doorway. "Why is she in my house?" I asked immediately. Daniel didn't look up. "She wanted to talk," he said quietly. Patricia folded her hands. "I think we need to resolve this properly." I walked in slowly. "You don't get to resolve anything. You illegally tested a child and then distributed private medical accusations to my workplace." Her expression didn't change. "I protected my family from uncertainty," she replied. "By destroying it," I snapped. Daniel finally looked at me then, and what I saw there made my chest tighten. Not anger. Not defense. Confusion. He was slipping into the space she had created. The space where nothing was certain anymore. I asked for clarification from a second lab. Patricia said calmly. My blood went cold. "What second lab?" She slid another document across the table. This one is independent, no connection to my first test. I didn't even want to touch it. But I did. And this time the result line was different. Not 0. Not mismatch. Instead, non-exclusion of maternal relationship inconclusive due to insufficient genetic markers. That was worse. Because it was vague enough to be dangerous. It's garbage, I said immediately. That result means degraded sample or contamination. It is not evidence. Patricia leaned back. Or it means inconsistency. No, I said sharply. It means your entire sampling process is unreliable. Daniel finally spoke. Which lab did this? Patricia hesitated. Just for a second. And I caught it. Upstate Private Diagnostics, she said. I exhaled slowly. I knew that lab. Not personally, but professionally. And they had a reputation, not for accuracy, but for producing results that matched what clients wanted to see. That was her mistake. She didn't choose truth. She chose confirmation. I want full chain of custody documentation, I said immediately. Patricia smiled slightly. Of course you do. She handed me a USB drive. I assume you'll find everything you need. That night after she left, Daniel finally broke. Not loudly. Not violently. Just quietly. I don't understand what's real anymore, he said. We were standing in the kitchen, lights off except for the stove clock glowing 11:48 p.m. I looked at him carefully. That's the point, I said softly. He frowned. What? Confusion is what happens when someone controls information distribution instead of facts. He rubbed his face. Emily, my mother wouldn't do this unless she believed something was wrong. And what if she believed it because she created the conditions for it to look that way? I asked. That made him pause. I walked over to the counter and opened my laptop. I've spent the last 17 years analyzing genetic data, I said. Do you know what the most common cause of false exclusion results is in private testing? He didn't answer. Sample contamination, I said. Improper collection or deliberate substitution. I turned the screen toward him. I pulled the metadata from that first report Patricia gave us. It's missing time stamps, missing technician ID. That shouldn't be possible in a legitimate lab system. His eyes scanned it slowly. I also cross-referenced the second lab she used, I continued. They've had 3 regulatory complaints in the last 2 years for inconsistent results. Daniel sat down slowly. So what are you saying? He asked. I hesitated. Because this was the part that mattered. Not anger. Not accusation. Truth. I'm saying, I said carefully, that she didn't find evidence Lily isn't part of this family. I looked at him directly. I'm saying she found a way to make it look like she did. Silence. Long. Heavy. Finally he whispered, why would she do that? And I didn't answer immediately. Because I already knew the direction this was going. And I didn't want to say it out loud yet. Instead, I said something else. Because someone in this family needed to be excluded for her version of the truth to make sense. Daniel looked up sharply. No. But his voice wasn't strong. It was defensive. And I realized something in that moment that hurt more than anything Patricia had done. She didn't just attack my daughter. She successfully created doubt inside her own son. And once that seed is planted, even truth takes time to grow back over it. I closed my laptop slowly. This isn't over, I said quietly. Daniel didn't respond. But for the first time since all of this began, he didn't disagree with me either. By Friday, the situation had stopped feeling like a family crisis and started feeling like something closer to a controlled collapse. Not loud, not dramatic. Just steady erosion. Daniel moved like a man walking through fog, present but never fully anchored. He still came home, still ate dinner, still asked Lily about school when she was with us, but there was a pause before everything now, like he was double-checking reality before speaking it. And Patricia had gone from family member to architect of uncertainty. She wasn't calling as much anymore. She didn't need to. The doubt she had planted was doing the work for her. At work, I was officially temporarily reassigned pending internal review. That was the polite version. The real version was isolation, no active cases, no access to sensitive files, no genetic sequencing duties. A lab technologist without a lab. It's a strange thing, being removed from the system you trust most. Because in my world, systems don't lie, people do. But when people start manipulating systems, even truth starts looking suspicious. That morning I sat in the hospital parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before going in, just staring at the dashboard clock. 7:58 a.m. 8:03 a.m. 8:07 a.m. Like if I waited long enough, the day might reassign itself. It didn't. At 8:20 I walked into HR. At 8:22 I signed paperwork acknowledging the review. At 8:25 I was escorted out of the genetics wing. No accusations formally made, no termination. Just distance. By 10:00 a.m. I was sitting at home when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But something in me already knew. Mrs. Carter, a man's voice said, "Yes, this is Attorney Samuel Whittaker. I believe we need to speak regarding a matter involving your mother-in-law, Patricia Reynolds." My body went still. "I'm not retaining a lawyer," I said immediately. "I understand," he replied calmly. "I'm not calling on behalf of you. I'm calling because I've been contacted regarding a will dispute that may involve you indirectly." That word "will" cut through everything. "Explain," I said. There was a pause. Then he said, "Mrs. Reynolds' husband passed away in 2022, correct?" "Yes." There are provisions in his estate documents that are currently being re-examined due to recent allegations of undue influence and identity-based exclusion within the family structure. I frowned. What does that have to do with me? Another pause. "That's what I'm trying to determine," he said, "but your name appears in correspondence attached to the estate file." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "My name," I repeated. "Yes, along with references to your daughter." That was the first real moment. I felt the ground shift in a different direction. Not just social fallout anymore. Legal structure. Paper trails. Systems that don't care about emotion. They care about documentation. "I didn't know anything about an estate dispute," I said slowly. "That may be why I'm calling," he replied, "because someone is trying to reopen the circumstances under which certain beneficiaries were included or excluded." And then he said the sentence that changed everything. "Your mother-in-law's husband specifically named your daughter in a trust revision, dated March 14th, 2023. I stood up without realizing it. "That's not possible," I said immediately. "Why not?" "Because he never met my daughter," I said. Silence on the line. "Then are you certain?" And suddenly I was. Because memory is not documentation. And families are not always honest even in their legal structures. "I need to see it," I said. That afternoon, I met Attorney Whittaker at a small office downtown Hartford. No grand building, no intimidation tactics. Just beige walls, a desk, and a file folder that looked too ordinary to contain anything important. He opened it carefully. Inside were copies of estate documents, signatures, witness statements, amendments, and there it was. A trust revision signed by Robert Reynolds, Daniel's father, dated March 14th, 2023. It included Lily Carter by name. As a beneficiary. My breath caught. "That's not real," I said again, but softer this time. Whittaker adjusted his glasses. "It appears legally executed, witnessed, notarized." I don't understand, I whispered. He slid another page forward. This is the attached letter of intent. I read it slowly, and the words didn't match anything Patricia had built. It wasn't cold. It wasn't suspicious. It was personal. If anything happens to me, it read, I want my granddaughter Lily to be included in the family trust. Blood does not define belonging, stability does. My throat tightened. She said he never accepted Lily, I said quietly. Whittaker watched me carefully. That's not what this indicates. I kept reading. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A handwritten note in the margin. In ink that looked slightly uneven, like it had been written near the end of something. I trust Emily more than I trust the version of family I see forming around me. My hands went cold. That wasn't just sentiment. That was warning. A record of awareness. Whittaker leaned forward slightly. There's something else. He opened a second file. This is correspondence between Mr. Reynolds and a private investigator he hired 6 months before his death. I looked up sharply. Why would he hire a pie? Whittaker hesitated. Because he suspected financial manipulation within his household. Silence. And then everything inside me shifted. Not confusion anymore. Pattern recognition. Because now the DNA testing didn't sit alone. It connected. Everything connected. I exhaled slowly. Patricia didn't just test my daughter. Whittaker nodded slightly. That is what the evidence suggests. She was trying to invalidate her existence within the family structure, I continued, thinking out loud now. Remove her from legal standing, or weaken her claim. Whittaker didn't confirm it. But he didn't deny it either. That was enough. I left the office with copies of everything. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't just reacting. I was building a timeline. That night I confronted Daniel. Not emotionally. Not angrily. Clinically. I laid the documents on the kitchen table like evidence. And I told him everything. He read silently for a long time. Longer than I expected. When he finished, he didn't speak immediately. He just sat there, staring at the paper with his father's handwriting. Finally, he said, She told me Dad never trusted you. I nodded slowly. That's not what this says. He rubbed his face hard. I don't know what to believe anymore. And that was the breaking point I had been waiting for. Not his anger. Not his defense of her. His exhaustion. Because doubt is sustainable only when it serves a purpose. When it doesn't, it collapses inward. I think your mother didn't just test a sample, I said quietly. I think she tested a narrative she needed to be true. He looked up at me slowly. And what is that narrative? He asked. I hesitated. Then said it. That Lily doesn't belong so she can justify control over what your father left behind. Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Daniel whispered, You're saying this is about money. I shook my head slowly. No, I said, I'm saying it started as control. Money just became the structure she used to enforce it. That night Daniel didn't sleep in our bed. He slept on the couch. And I knew, sitting in the dark upstairs listening to the house breathe differently now, that the final stage of this wasn't between me and Patricia anymore. It was between Daniel and the truth about his mother. And that kind of truth doesn't just change families. It decides what's left of them afterward. The next morning came in a way I didn't expect, quiet, almost ordinary. Lily spilled cereal on the kitchen floor at 7:12 a.m. and laughed when I told her she was supposed to aim for the bowl, not the table. Daniel stood near the sink, watching her like he was trying to memorize something before it disappeared. For a moment, it almost felt normal again. Almost. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen and went still. Mom, he said quietly. I didn't move. He answered. For a few seconds, there was only her voice on speaker. Controlled, measured, the same tone she used when she believed she was in control of a situation. Then Daniel said, "We know about Dad's trust." Silence on the other end. Not surprise. Calculation. "I was going to explain that," Patricia finally said. "That's not what I asked," he replied. I could hear his voice changing as he spoke, not louder, not angrier. Clearer. For the first time since this started. "You tested my daughter," he said. "You went into my marriage, you used my father's name, you involved lawyers and hospitals. Why?" Patricia exhaled softly, like she was disappointed the conversation had reached this level. "I was protecting you," she said. That sentence landed differently now. It didn't carry authority anymore, it just sounded empty. "Protecting me from what?" Daniel asked. A pause. "Then from being manipulated." I almost laughed. But it didn't come out. Daniel looked at me briefly, then back at the phone. "Mom," he said slower now, "you fabricated a genetic claim about my child." "I verified a concern," she corrected. "No," he said firmly, "you created it." That word, created, shifted something in the room. Even Lily went quiet, sensing the change in tone. I stepped closer, not to interrupt but to be present. Daniel continued. "Dad's trust includes Lily," he said. "You knew that." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Patricia said, "That document is being misinterpreted." "No," Daniel replied, "it's being read." Silence again. I could almost hear the shift on her end, the moment where control stops working. When silence no longer intimidates anyone. Finally, she said something I didn't expect. "I did what I thought was necessary after Robert started changing things behind my back." There it was. Not denials. Admission of motive. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You mean when he included his granddaughter in his estate?" A faint breath. "You don't understand the full situation," she said. "I understand enough," he replied. And then, for the first time, I heard something in Patricia's voice crack. Not guilt. Not remorse. Loss of leverage. "I am your mother," she said sharply. "And I am your son," Daniel replied. "That's exactly why this has to stop." Silence. Then the call ended. No dramatic hang-up. Just disconnection. Like a system shutting itself off. The following week moved differently. Not faster. Not slower. Just cleaner. Daniel filed a formal complaint regarding the unauthorized DNA testing and the dissemination of private genetic information. I didn't ask him to. He did it himself, quietly, precisely, the way someone acts when they finally stop negotiating with confusion. The hospital review concluded 2 weeks later. My access was restored, no breach found, no contamination, no misconduct, just external interference with no basis in institutional fact. That phrase stayed with me for a long time. External interference. It sounded almost clinical. But that's all it was. Someone trying to overwrite a system they didn't understand. Patricia didn't attend Lily's school play in November. She didn't call on Thanksgiving. She didn't send anything at Christmas. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology, no last-minute reversal where everything becomes neat again. Just absence. And in a strange way, that was the final confirmation. Because control, when it fails, often doesn't explode. It withdraws. 3 months later, Daniel and I met with the estate attorney again. The trust was finalized. Lily's name remained exactly where Robert Reynolds had placed it. No amendments removed it. No challenges succeeded. Everything Patricia had tried to destabilize held. But sitting there in that office, signing the final documents, I realized something I didn't expect. None of this felt like victory. Not really. Because even when truth prevails on paper, people still carry what they went through. And I saw it in Daniel sometimes, The way he still paused before answering certain questions, like he was double-checking reality before trusting it again. And I saw it in Lily too, in smaller ways. The way she asked, "Is this okay?" more often than she used to. The way she looked for reassurance before assuming she was safe. That part didn't disappear just because the documents were corrected. Healing doesn't work like legal resolution. It's slower, less visible, more uneven. One evening, I was standing in the kitchen alone, washing dishes while Lily did homework at the table, and Daniel fixed a loose cabinet hinge. Ordinary sounds, normal movement. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something might break. It just felt like life continuing. Lily looked up suddenly. "Mom." "Yes, am I still part of everyone?" The question hit harder than anything Patricia ever said. I turned off the water, dried my hands and walked over to her. "You don't have to be tested to belong," I said quietly. She nodded like she understood, then went back to her homework. Daniel glanced at me from across the room. And I could see it in his face now, not confusion. Not doubt. Something steadier. Understanding that some people don't destroy families with force. They do it with certainty that they're right. That night after Lily went to bed, Daniel sat next to me on the couch. No phones. No distractions. Just quiet. "I keep thinking about my dad," he said. "I know," I replied. "He saw this coming," Daniel continued, "and I didn't." I looked at him carefully. "None of us see everything coming," I said. "That's not the point." He exhaled slowly. "Then what is?" I thought about it for a moment. About DNA, about systems, about data and how people misuse it when they don't understand its limits. And I said, the point is knowing what to trust when everything around you is being questioned. He nodded slowly. We sat in silence for a while. Then he said something quieter. "I'm sorry I doubted you." I didn't answer immediately. Because I knew what mattered more than apology was change. "I don't need you to never doubt anything," I said finally. "I need you to know what you come back to when doubt is used against you." He looked at me and nodded. Months later, life didn't become perfect. It just became stable again. Patricia remained distant, legally bound, emotionally absent, a name that no longer shaped decisions. And one afternoon, as I picked Lily up from school, she ran toward me holding a drawing. It was simple. Stick figures, 3 people holding hands. And above it, in uneven handwriting, she had written, "My family." I stood there for a long moment just looking at it. Not because it was profound, but because it was ordinary. And after everything, ordinary felt like something earned. That night I wrote something in my personal notebook, the kind I keep separate from lab work, separate from evidence, separate from anything that can be challenged. Just thoughts. And I wrote this. Truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as correction, sometimes as exposure, but the hardest truth is this: belonging cannot be proven by data. It can only be lived consistently enough that no one feels the need to test it. I closed the notebook. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was defending my family anymore. I felt like I was simply living in it. Not perfect, not untouched, but real. And that, I've learned, is the only thing that actually survives when everything else gets tested.